who's joined us to this evening's drawing discussion. I'm Anita Taylor and I'm the Director of Drawing Projects UK, Trinity Buoy Drawing Prize, and also the Dean of Duncan of Jordanstone College of Art and Design at the University of Dundee. And it's my pleasure, as always, to convene the drawing discussions that accompany the Trinity Buoy Wharf Drawing Prize exhibition. And this is the first of this series supported by Arts Council England, taking place via the Drawing Projects UK portal, but in association with the exhibition at Drawing Projects in Wiltshire. So can I say an incredibly warm welcome to everybody who's joined us this evening, and an incredibly warm welcome to Craig Fisher and Andrea Cryer, who are here to talk to us about their drawings that have been selected for the exhibition by Sheila Gowder, Simon Groom and Zoe Whitley, who were the selectors for this year's Drawing Prize. As always, it's an enormous pleasure to think about the individual drawings as they're selected for the show. Everything is done on visual values alone, and the sense of the drawings and how much they convey through the work itself. So we start these drawing discussions looking at the drawing in particular made by the artists, and to hear the artists talk to us about their prerogatives, their work within the exhibition. So here we are with Craig and Andrea's drawings on the screen. And as you can see, there may be some things that they have in common in terms of making, but we're here to hear from them individually and to hear what motivates them about the drawings, what it is about the drawings themselves. But I'm going to introduce each individually. They will talk about their drawings individually, and then there'll be a question and answer session. So I would really welcome everybody in the audience thinking about the questions that they want to ask and popping those into the chat while people are speaking, so that we can gather your thoughts and questions. And I'm sure that we're in for an incredibly inspiring evening. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Craig to talk about his drawing, Pages from My Sketchbook 2020.
Thank you everybody. Thanks for attending tonight. It's really exciting. It's a real pleasure to be here. So yeah, I will try my best. I might get a bit carried away. If there are questions, please note them down, and that might help me kind of with my generate some discussion later on. But this is a series of ongoing, a series of works that are kind of ongoing, and it part of a I suppose my work has been engaged in kind of working with textiles in various ways over a number of years. But this body of work started, I made a piece kind of a long time ago where I'd made this piece of paper, and so this is a so these are the pieces of paper. So these are machine embroidered kind of linen, and I kind of replicate page out of a notebook. And I became really interested in this idea of how could drawing, the relationship of drawing and painting to sculpture, and this kind of idea of a kind of in-between space. And I'm interested in I'm really excited by ideas of representation and notions of replication, and drawing seems to be the thing that is a real driver. Drawing seems to be the starting point. It's almost like my filter. So it's like a part of a Craig Fisher filter. I kind of draw, and then the drawings seem to kind of become other things. But I was kind of interested in these drawings that I make all the time, what would happen if I started to translate them, or started to think about them as like the objectness of a drawing, or the thingness of a drawing. So I started to get interested in this idea of a kind of folded pieces of paper, and kind of what you can see and what you can't see, and these drawings were kind of made. This set of drawings were made during the kind of one of the first lockdowns, kind of when we started our experience of having a lockdown. And I often I can often draw things that are kind of around me, or so kind of paying attention to me procrastinating in front of my computer. So there's loads of cups of kind of coffee, and so the kind of the quotidian and the everyday. So that was kind of things I was drawing. But I was also I'd started to get really involved in looking at other artists, and so I'm kind of interested in both those kind of high art references and then more kind of popular cultural references, or the everyday. And so that sense of Philip Guston is somebody that I kind of go back to and I return to, and he's somebody that I'm really interested in, and kind of as a kind of I think is kind of a seminal figure in terms of thinking about my own practice and some of the kind of, as well as the kind of content of his work. I'm kind of really interested in this idea of, this kind of the way that he plays with kind of modes of representation. And so I started to think, so I became what I think I started, I found I was given a book as a present, which was connected to the show that was going to happen, the kind of big retrospective, the Guston retrospective that was going to happen at Tate, which was postponed due to the Black Lives Matter movement. And I kind of was drawing from this book almost like a kind of form of visual research, because I kind of wanted to kind of almost get to know, I wanted to get to know the way that he made the drawings and paintings. So by drawing them, by redrawing them, I kind of wanted to kind of get to understand them. And so I had this kind of book, kind of this notebook full of drawings, and I wanted to then kind of translate or transcribe the drawings somehow. And then I remembered this sheet of paper I'd made, and then I've been starting to make these kind of sheets of paper, and then would start to so there's something quite interesting about these things that maybe kind of take up that there's a kind of speed at which I make these drawings, and they kind of there's a kind of, I'm kind of interested in that kind of slowing that down by stitching them, by making them kind of using textiles and using embroidery. So there's this kind of combination of both machine embroidery and kind of hand embroidery, and so and I want to kind of replicate that line, that drawing, that sense of but I'm also kind of interested in that sense of I suppose it kind of investment. There's this kind of relationship to maybe how I visualize my ideas, and how this kind of idea of visual thinking or visual research. And I started to then think about the idea that to give everything a kind of equivalence. So the kind of handwritten notes are as important as the drawing that I've drawn, the drawing or the kind of lines of the paper. And I'm kind of interested in this kind of the status of this object, and maybe what you see first. Or I think it's quite interesting, because there's a real interesting thing when you see them in reality, because they have a kind of a different type of presence in you when you see them replicated kind of as an image. I'm really interested in their materiality, in the kind of, and maybe how these drawings can be kind of seductive, but also some of the content is also maybe can be described as, I don't know, quite provocative, or there's something about the kind of the imagery that Guston used and the kind of relationship to the Ku Klux Klan. I'm interested in that idea of how he talks. He talks about this notion of what it was to describe evil, or I can't remember the quote now, but there's something about the kind of sense of how I want these, almost these quite different types of visual language to be brought together in one space, but also that you also know that I'm referencing, you know, I'm referencing other artists, and I'm not. I want that to be quite explicit. That I'm kind of contextual. I'm using a kind of context that I, you know. So there's something about a kind of about, yeah, the kind of labor. There's a kind of idea of labor, but also these different kinds of motif or visual motif that I'm also really kind of fascinated by and interested in. And so yeah, so this is kind of, so the idea of this is it's an ongoing series. So as I kind of make drawings in my sketchbook, then I'm starting to kind of translate them into these kind of embroidered works. Anita, if you could go to the next slide, it might be quite interesting to see that now. So this is just to give you a sense of that idea of their kind of objectness, and I'm kind of interested in then maybe by folding them, you also start to create the idea of that you only are able to see certain elements of a drawing, or an element of what's on that piece of sheet of paper, and I want you to think, yeah, I quite like the idea that you might that there's a kind of, like, they're quite performative. I kind of want, you know, how can a drawing be performative? How can it be, how you know, that sense of when can something be yeah, like I suppose I'm kind of quite fascinated by this idea that when can when is something an image, like that as I said before, this kind of in-betweenness. So I want the work to kind of to push kind of boundaries, I suppose, to test boundaries. And I think textiles and the use of textiles is actually a really kind of interesting medium, because it's quite I think it can be quite subversive, and quite it kind of, I think the idea of, you know, the idea of using cloth and for me, as I suppose one of the things that I was always quite interested in relation to kind of using textiles is this idea that you know, you think of textiles in its kind of traditional context as something that kind of maybe kind of is more kind of associated with women, and I'm kind of interested in those kinds of, again, those kinds of boundaries, and how I might play with them, really, or how that might be kind of challenged. So there's kind of certain kinds of perceptions or kind of ideas that we held on to, and how can you kind of challenge that or question it? So yeah, that's, I don't know whether that's 10 minutes. I think it may be. So I don't know whether is that a good place to stop, Anita?
It sounds perfect, and a really good introduction to your focus, concepts, concerns behind the drawing. So if we can say we'll introduce Andrea. I have a feeling that my connection is slightly slow, so I'm hoping that people can hear me. But what a wonderful introduction, Craig, thank you. And I'm going to move on and introduce Andrea to talk about her drawing called Searching. And really a big welcome, Andrea. Really looking forward to hearing you talk to your drawing, and really encouraging everybody in the audience to think about the questions that you have that are building up from what was a really interesting introduction by Craig. So over to you, Andrea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anita, and thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be part of this fantastic exhibition, and having visited it twice, I've noted a lot of things I hadn't seen in the first visit, so thank you for that. My drawing is called Searching. It's a stitched drawing of my mum, and she's in her late 80s. And during the second lockdown, during the COVID pandemic, she came to stay with us because we were going to shield her. So I spent a lot of time chatting with her. She's a very proud, determined, strong and stubborn Yorkshire lady. and she's very loved, and she has a wicked sense of humour and very often forgets to use a filter. And what I wanted to show in this drawing is her steeliness, but underneath all that, her vulnerability. And while she was staying with us here in Wiltshire, I took lots of photos of her and did a few simple sketches. And we chatted a lot, you know, about her life and about, you know, what her family was doing in different parts of the country. She's got 18 grandchildren and 8 great-grandchildren. So she's very much the matriarch of our large family. And as I said, she's a very strong personality. And I took lots of photos of her and took a few videos. And as I was going through the videos, because when I tend to do my portrait work, I sometimes take a video of someone and then try and capture a screenshot. And very often that gives me an emotive image that I can then translate into a portrait. So on this particular occasion, she had been knitting, which is her favourite occupation, apart from when she's not down the rabbit hole of the internet on her new mobile. And I was doing a series of drawings of her, taking photos with a view to preparing a large scale painted portrait, but painted with thread. So this was just, for me, it's a very simple sketch as opposed to a very detailed drawing. And it's created using a simple, basic domestic sewing machine. I found some fabric in a flea market. It was full of moth holes, but it had a very beautiful texture because it was vintage woolen blanket. So I took it home, put it in a very high wash, obviously, because I didn't know where it come from. And that created a really beautiful bumpy texture, which I thought would suit a portrait of an elderly person. And you can't really see it from the photograph on the screen, but when you see it in real life, I haven't been able to flatten the fabric by ironing, so it's quite lumpy. And I think that reflects age and history. So I thought it's quite important to choose the right fabric for the character of the person that I was drawing. So as I said, I've used a basic sewing machine. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with stitching with a sewing machine, but you have the 2 threads, one top, one bottom. So you have to be very careful about what tension you use. And because I wanted this to be a sketch, I was using my sewing machine at full speed so that I could do very, very quick mark making. And the problem with that, obviously, if you make a mistake when you're stitching, it's very difficult to change it. There's no rubber. And I had to keep my stitches loose because I think that reflected the emotion of the actual drawing. I used a limited palette of black because I like the image to look as if it's a pen and ink drawing from a distance, so that as you approach it and get closer, you can see that it's got a textural element and it's very different to what you might expect. If you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide, please. This is just a close-up of the eyes and part of the hair. And as you can see, the shading around the eyes, it looks a little bit manic, and it was manic the way I was using the machine. I've had the machine many years and I use it quite intuitively. So I like to stitch very quickly, which means that the marks will go off in lots of different directions. But having said that, every time you stitch, it's a considered mark. So you have to decide where the needle and thread enters the fabric and where it exits the fabric. As I said before, I've used a muted palette with a black thread, but the eyes have grey and white stitching, which has been done by hand. And that's because my mum has actually got really bright blue eyes. And also in the hair, I was looking to give a sense of the age of my mum and also the highlights. But what I don't want to do is to fill a drawing full of marks. I try and use the mark making to identify different features or the most important features that will actually show you some element of that particular person. So I'm just going through my notes to make sure I'm covering everything. I'm really fascinated by using a sewing machine. And there's a number of reasons why. Firstly, it's an unusual, I think, mark making tool, but it's a very effective mark making tool. It adds an interesting textural element to a drawing. So you get the base fabric, and then you can have a layer of stitching. On top of that, you can have another layer. So you can superimpose lots and lots of layers of stitching, and that will give either a very fine line, or it can give you very, very detailed like hatching or shadowing. So you can add depth to a drawing by overstitching or by even leaving the threads loose. And you can't really see from the drawing here or the photo here, but a lot of the thread is loose on the hair. So again, that gives a sense of the portrait being more of a sketch than my having used like considered line making. So the thing I like about stitching with a sewing machine is that you're using linear marks. So a single stitch cannot be a curve. So in order to make a curvilinear mark, you have to think about where your stitching is going to be, how many stitches you need to make a curve, which direction you need to go in, whether or not your curve becomes part of the negative area of the image or part of the actual stitched area of the image. So it's important to pay attention to the negative areas, to look at the spaces between the stitches. And that gives, I think, a bigger impact on the visual element of the portrait. You can't use a rubber with a sewing machine. So very often, if you stitch too densely, you cannot unpick it. And that's why I love the phrase happy accidents, because I do have many of those. And you just have to go with it. With the back of the fabric, very often you'll get the image that you've drawn, but it will have an added dimension because there will be knots and there will be snags and there will be threads that have been intertwined. So I brought a sample. This is the front of an image. It's actually David Hockney, and that is the rear of the image. You can see all the knots. And sometimes when I'm displaying a portrait, I will display the rear of the image as opposed to the stitched areas that I've actually concentrated on, because you get a sense of the person, but you get the added element of not really knowing what's happening at the back of your fabric whilst you're stitching. So it's sort of out of your control, but it still gives you a recognizable image of the person that you are portraying. I don't really think I have much more to say at this point, because I think I might have reached my 10 minutes, but I'm very happy to answer any questions.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Andrea. And you can see there are starting to come some questions in through the chat, but I think what was really interesting about both of your presentations is about that question of precision. And actually, they're both used to convey things that appear quite informal. So it's a really interesting dichotomy between the use of a very precise stitch in order to give the sensation of something that is a sketch. And both of you are trying, well, are not just trying, are emulating that. So I think what I'm going to do is pick up some of the questions in the chat between you, and then let's see where we go from there with other things. So I'm sorry if you can see the mouse just getting to the chat. box. But Craig had a question for you, Andrea, which Craig can probably ask you,
Okay.
which is
I was
to start things off so that you're both talking.
Hi, Andrea. I was just asking. Do you use a hoop?
I did use a hoop on that particular drawing, but sometimes I don't. If I can get fabric that is dense enough so that you can stitch free motion without a hoop.
So do you use the needle as is it like a free? So it's not got any.
Yeah, you have to drop the feed dogs on your machine, and it's free motion so that you can stitch in any direction because you can move your fabric in any direction.
Yeah. Because there's a I don't know whether you know, but there's a really amazing. I used to work at Goldsmiths a long time ago, and I worked in the textiles department, and they used to use these things called Irish singers.
Oh yeah.
And they're really amazing machines. They're like in terms of what I do, you kind of use it.
I stitched my thumb on one of those.
Yeah, they're quite amazing.
Yeah, I didn't realise it was so lethal. And actually, it didn't hurt. It was just a surprise to see that I actually had a row of 5 stitches across my thumb.
Wow.
Yeah. It didn't stop using it though. It's like one of my favourite machines.
They're fantastic things, aren't they? And actually, Andrea, you were at Baspar, weren't you, where they have fantastic Irish embroidery machines and also the very big digital kit as well.
Big digital one.
Yeah, that's a shame. But actually, what you're doing freehand is actually it's such a beautiful space, isn't it, in terms of drawing with stitch?
It's quite freeing. I mean, when Craig was mentioning the hoop, the only problem with doing a big portrait is you do have to move the hoop lots. So you have to decide where you're going to put the first hoop, and usually it's the eyes. If I get the eyes wrong, I have to start again, and then you have to move your hoop along. But I've got an old machine, and it doesn't give me a lot of space to use a big hoop, so it's continually moving. So it can be a little bit annoying, but that's the way it is when you're stitching with a sewing machine.
Yeah, both of you are real experts in this. It's rather wonderful to hear you talking. There's another question which I think is for you. After you, Craig.
I was just going to say it's really interesting because I think what Andrew was saying about that idea of this kind of sense of kind of how the kind of making or unmaking of something. For me, if I get so far along with something, and I have, in a sense, I would have to either unpick it completely or I'd need to start again. So I thought that was quite interesting in terms of, because for me the kind of sense of the kind of almost the kind of graphic sensibility of the lines, it's kind of if it doesn't translate, or if it, I would then have to kind of, because I use a lot of back stitch, I just have to unpick it all. It has to all just be kind of like, it kind of I don't all the drawn elements are kind of hand embroidered, because I kind of want to take that time over it to kind of replicate it. But I have that kind of, it's quite interesting because I can really sympathise if it kind of goes wrong, then you kind of end up having to restart.
I think because your work is so precise, I don't think you can probably get away with the happy accidents that I can get away with.
Not in the same way. I think it kind of almost the happy accident happens at the point of drawing it in the notebook. Actually,
right. Yeah.
That's kind of when the happy accidents happen, because sometimes I'll draw something in a certain way and I kind of like how it's turned out, and then in a way that's what I replicate when I stitch them into the. So that's the replication element is the thing that I had kind of. I'm true to what I do in the book, really. But the accidental or that kind of sense of improvisation kind of almost happens at the point
before you start stitching.
Yeah, when I'm using the pencil.
So in terms of, I mean, there's a question in the chat which is directed at Andrea, but maybe it's for both of you. In terms of transferring the image onto the fabric, how is that happening? Is it a drawing process that does that?
Will be after my secret.
depends how much you're prepared to give away.
I tend to do a pencil drawing first, because I need to make sure that I get the features where they need to be approximately, because as I've said before, if you make a mistake, it's very difficult to unpick it, and sometimes you have to start again. So although I work freely, I need to have the basic elements drawn onto the fabric. So I could use what do you call it, a dissolvable pen, or a pen that where you have a bit of ink and then it dissolves over time. Or sometimes I use a dissolvable fabric, which means that I will draw my portrait on paper. I will then redraw it on dissolvable fabric. So, and then the dissolvable fabric is then attached to my canvas, and then I stitch it. So really I'm looking at the drawing 3 times. So I'm stitching it once, I'm drawing it twice. And I never ever draw exactly the same line as the original pencil drawing. So it changes as I go, because if I'm using a photo as reference, then when I'm stitching, I always have the photo on my computer. And as I'm stitching, I don't just look at my hoop, I also look at the photograph as well. So that's probably why I end up with stitches in my fingers and things, but that's the way I work.
That's really interesting, because that's really a similar activity for me. You know, it's a kind of case of drawing and redrawing.
Yeah.
And actually, and so it's like a reference of a reference of a reference of a reference of a reference. I kind of, it's almost like, and that's kind of what I meant by a kind of filter. There's like this kind of filtering process. It's like what's necessary, or what's needed, or how can I, you know, I think for me, I think, yeah, there's something through, even though I'm trying to replicate something that I've drawn, actually the act of stitching will inevitably changes that. So you kind of get it kind of evolves.
That's right, develops. Yeah,
the making, absolutely.
So the thing that holds you together actually is that sense of the phrase that you used, Craig, which is repetition and replication.
Yeah.
But actually the repetitive process to get to something that forms the equivalent to your the message you want to convey, the idea you want to convey, is really insistent, isn't it? It's really very fascinating as a process to draw that out, literally to draw that out through the stitch. There are quite a number of questions coming in, so I'm going to try and bring some of those to you. And some of them, quite a lot, are around the process, but there are a number which are touching on some of the things about the role of the stitch. I mean, one is directed at Andrea to talk about whether the sewing machine becomes a power tool. That expands as a question to something as an act of aggression, but I'm not so sure how that sits in the context of a drawing, which I think is rather a loving drawing, a drawing that's quite intimate and focused on someone's features as a portrait. But I wonder about that thing about the sewing machine as a power tool, the thing that you talked about, Craig, in terms of the gendered view of stitching and drawing, and whether there's something in there about the choice to make through stitch for both of you. And that's really a very open comment and question.
Well, I think stitching can be aggressive, but I think, but I also, you know, I think if you think about, you know, I think there's going to be an amazing show, isn't there, in February that opens at the Hayward, which will be all of Louise Bourgeois' kind of fabric works. And I think there's something about the way that she talks about aggression in relation to stitch, and kind of you know, there's a kind of the psychoanalytical aspect of kind of textiles, and I think textiles have such, for me, it's that kind of, it is about the kind of the associative values and the kind of this richness in terms of the kind of that richness in terms of associations of gender, of class, of status, value, the idea of relationship of craft to art. Where do we draw the lines? You know, how can something, what does it mean for me as a man to make things using textiles. I am really interested in those kinds of questions, and I think, you know, as somebody who's used a sewing machine for a number of years, they are power tools. They're quite scary. They can be quite scary things. But yeah, I'm really interested in. For me, I use textiles a lot because I'm interested in how they can be kind of transgressive. I think it can. I think it is. Yeah, I think I use it as almost as a subversive strategy. I want you. I think I often make things that are a challenge, that challenge you in terms of looking at them and having to look at them again. So the softening of something through the use of fabric can kind of arrest you to look at something in like, oh, you know, like, so, you know, an earlier work, or one of probably the largest work I've ever made was a car crash made out of fabric, and it's these two Mini Coopers that have been crashed together. And for me, that was absolutely about that sense of what textiles and stitch, and so you're looking at something that is kind of catastrophic event, and then it's kind of made anodyne or sanitized through this use of this. It's softened, it's made dumb, but it's still got this kind of power, you know. So for me, it's that is really, I think textiles is really important for me in conceptually.
That's really a fantastic answer. Thanks, Craig. Andrea, did you have any thoughts on that? I mean, they are hugely powerful machines, sewing machines. It's quite different than hand stitching.
Yeah, hand stitching is like a slow, like methodical, meditative process. But I think using a sewing machine can be as well. It depends what you're actually trying to produce. I mean, when I said that, you know, I was sewing at speed, I don't always sew at speed. It depends which part of the portrait I'm trying to convey. So if it's a bit of shading and I want long lines or long stitches rather, then I do rag my sewing machine a little bit. And as it's old, it's made of metal, so it can take a bit of a battering. And if I wanted to draw a fine line, then I would have to slow down. So yeah, it's a tool, but I think it's a tool that is quite easily controlled by the user. And also, I don't really think historically it's gender specific, because tailors who produce artwork, generally men, or historically have been male. So I think a sewing machine is available for anybody to use, and the fact that there are 2 stitched images in this fantastic exhibition should be seen as an encouragement to anybody, male, female, or whatever, to actually try something different and maybe use stitch using a sewing machine, or thread and needle as a drawing tool. So anybody, whatever age, have a go.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the joy of the show and the joy of having these 2 very specific drawings using stitch. There are other drawings probably that do have some stitch in them, and we've had drawings made with stitch previously in other exhibitions. I think what's so specific about these is the way that they're talking about sketching or sketchbooks, and there's something really distinctive about the way that the stitch is used to convey an illusion, not just to carry the sense of a mark through space, but that mark is applied to recreating something. So it's a very they're both very exciting to see, and they're really exciting to see together. One of the questions in the chat is about whether they're presented under glass, and for those of you who saw the show in London, they were presented quite close together without glass. The joy of taking the show on tour is that we go into different venues that have different conditions to show in. And they are shown differently at drawing projects. So I know some of the people in the audience saw the show at the weekend. So I think Jules is here, and obviously Andrea, you saw it too, where Craig's is actually in a vitrine, so behind glass but not a frame. and Andrea's is actually on a stand so that you can see it quite close to. And we were very keen to do that with Andrea's because a lot of the discussion around the selection process was about the kind of amazing illusion, particularly around the hair, which is really, it shimmers. It's the most astonishing sense of what that hair must be like. And yours, Craig, exactly the same sort of precision. But I know that, I mean, there's a sense that people would pick yours up and play. And I'm not sure how much that's part of it. When you see your drawings folded, they sort of take on something like a crumpled piece of paper or a handkerchief or all sorts of things which are much more about applying or playing with or touching. And the invitation to touch them, I think, is slightly different. Or if there's an invitation to touch them at all, I don't think there's an invitation to touch yours either, Andrea.
No, I don't think there is actually, but I think that's a kind of, it's a common misconception when you use textiles because of their tactility. There is an innate kind of, and I'm the worst in the world. If I go into a fabric shop, the first thing I do will be touch every fabric I can get my hands on. And so, in that sense of partly I'm interested in, I use fabric because I'm interested in its potential to be seductive. I'm interested in the idea that you want to touch it, but I think for me, the interesting thing, one of the things that's interesting about the way that I show my work is often I won't show my work framed. It's actually about, that sense of this kind of in-betweenness, or this sense of how can this drawing operate, or how does it operate? And I want to push it. I want to push it as far as I can, and I've done that with a lot of work where I'm whether the work for me, as soon as I fold it, it becomes like a kind of it becomes, it's almost like it's performed. It's being performed with, and I want you then almost to think about a kind of there's a kind of action involved in it, and I think that's what's quite interesting about this body of work, is that for me, I'm interested in, like when it was shown in London, I like the idea that bits of it are, you can't see all of them, you can't see there's elements that you're not privy to, and the fact that they do all have fronts and backs, that this is a physical object, and so actually the thing that you can't see in mine is you can't see the back of the stitching, because you're not able to, because it's kind of inside this piece of paper. So it becomes a kind of, for me, I'm interested in how the work can kind of can test out the kind of limits of presentation, display. I wanted to push that.
Yeah, and I think the thing about both of them, that if you look at the ground the drawing is made on, the specificity of your linen, the specificity of the woolen blanket, I mean, I keep going back to how precise they are. It's a characteristic, I think, of the whole show. But there is something so beautiful about the equivalence of the ground and the stitch to both of your images that I think is quite extraordinary. There's a question from Alberto, who's another artist in the show, for Andrea, which is around the use of the immediacy within the drawing and the capacity that has for synthesis and freshness. And he wants to ask about when you decide it's finished, because your drawing has got much more provisionality about it, if you like, than Craig. So there is that question of what's the right moment for it to be concluded, in terms of, when it stops being on the hoop and goes on to this support that the wool blanket is stretched around.
Very often I overwork something, and I then, as I said before, struggle to unpick it. So as I'm stitching, or when I finished an area, I very often leave the portrait hanging for a while, and I will go back to it after a few days to decide what else I need to do, or whether or not I do actually have to remove something, or whether I just really need to stop and behave and move on to something else. So it's just judgment. Having done it over many years, you get to a stage where you know when something is finished. And also, I wanted to convey a particular emotion, and once I thought I had that, it tends to be with the eyes, which again, I've said before, I start with the eyes first. So I don't think I've overworked this particular one, because I think I've just about got it right. But with other images, I don't put as much mark making, I don't put as many lines in there. And I try and leave it to document someone's face just by the eyes, a little bit the nose, or maybe actually just a partial portrait. I don't often do the full head. So I may do like one side of the face, or I may do something in profile. So yeah, it's just practice, I think.
I think all of these things are about being completely on top of what you're doing, and both Alberto and Laura are also saying that you made the right, it is absolutely at that point, and that's the nature of the drawings that come through, is that they are absolutely very certain and confident in what they're conveying and how they're conveying it. You've talked a lot about portraits, and maybe you want to say something about how you got into making these sewn portraits, just briefly.
Oh, yep. I did a creative arts degree at Bath Spa doing fine art printmaking and textiles with Mandy Burnell. And when I was doing the etchings and monoprinting and dry point, I just, for some reason, was drawn to doing portraits. And I developed that into etchings onto fabric, which I then took into the textiles department and started stitching on them. So in addition to portraits, I do townscapes and landscapes, but I like the idea of doing a portrait because I like to be able to represent a certain fleeting moment of a person's character, whether I've met them or not. It's actually obviously a lot more easy to do a portrait of someone that you know very well. And the first time I did a large portrait was actually of my late mother-in-law. And these were very, very big portraits. They were I think 80 inches by 50 inches. And they were of her when she was 18 and when she was 88. And when she was 88, she came for a meal, and she had this look on her face, and I couldn't picture where I'd seen it before. And then I realized that she had the look of when she was 18, and it was from an old sepia photograph, like a professional photograph that they'd have had done in the 30s. And she had the same look, even though it was 70 years later. So I did a diptych portrait in stitch using my sewing machine. And that was the first time I'd used stitch properly using a sewing machine. But it was the fact that she was a lovely lady. I knew her very well. And she had just started with dementia. And it was a way of capturing her before we lost her. And I got 4 children, and my daughter was, one of my mother-in-law's favorite little people. And my daughter has lots of curly hair. So I had some of my daughter's hair in the stitching of the 18-year-old portrait. And my mother-in-law, Kath, used to be a seamstress, a tailoress, and she was struggling with this particular skirt that she liked. She wanted to shorten it. I don't know why. I don't think she was ever going to wear it. So I said, well, I'll help you do that. And for some reason, I kept some of the unpicked thread, and I incorporated that in the 88-year-old drawing. So it was very, very personal. And I think when you see those portraits together, you can see that there's a lot of emotion there, and which is why I think it's good to get commissions, obviously, but it is nice to be able to draw someone that you actually know.
Yeah, there's a wonderful familiarity, isn't there, and intimacy about stitching and thread. And I'm intrigued that you said that you were using hair. That was one of the conversations that took place around the white stitching in the hair on this one. Because the illusion is fantastic, and you know, both of these have such power, I think, as images. There's a question about the idea of precision connecting to making work in lockdown. The thing that's characteristic of the whole show is most of it's made in lockdown. I think there's very little that anyone made between January and the middle of March in 2020. It had to be from January 2020. And I wondered if either of you, we're going to be running a symposium on this later in the season of drawing discussions, but I wonder if either of you had reflections on making in lockdown and if that had an impact on what you were doing.
For me, it definitely did, because as a full-time academic, who I run a fine art course in Derby, and so for me, that shift to teaching online and what we couldn't do with our students meant that I was able to. I had time to kind of really, I was able to take some time to really focus on kind of my own making, and actually, so kind of, I felt for me it was really important that I'm trying to get students through this process, and it was a very challenging for all of us, but particularly for students, it felt really challenging, and I kind of wanted to do something alongside them, which felt like it could, so almost like I could champion that we can do this, we can make this happen, and if I can do it, you can do it, and let's do it together. So in a way, it felt for me, it was a really, you know, I made almost all of the sketchbook pages, and I was also making these banner works that I've been making, which are kind of using kind of embroidery and so that kind of based on Jolly Rogers. So for me it gave me time. It gave me some time to really focus on my own making, which was great in a way.
That's a fantastic answer. We are quite tight to time, so I don't know if Andrea, if you had a quick answer or you're happy to.
Well, for me with lockdown, it hasn't made a huge difference to how I work, because I tend to just zip off upstairs to my little studio when I want to anyway, and that's what I did during lockdown.
So. That sounds wonderful. I mean, I think the different effects for different people were very different, but I think there was a moment of thinking about how people being in their own space and being able to concentrate in a way is a very different thing. I'm going to leave my question there because I think we are coming up to the hour that we've invited you to speak to. So what I wanted to do is say the most enormous thank you to Craig and to Andrea for your generosity in sharing so much about your drawing. And I think it's always wonderful that a whole conversation comes out of looking at two drawings on screen, two drawings in an exhibition. And what I would like to say is that if people can visit the show, it's a really beautiful exhibition. It's selected, as I've said, by Sheila Gowda, the artist from Bangalore in India, Simon Groom, Director of National Galleries of Scotland, Modern and Contemporary Art National Galleries in Scotland, and Zoe Whitley, Director of Chisenhame in London, as well as the 13 drawings selected for the Working Drawing Award. It's a really beautiful show. It looks different, as Andrea has already said, in different places. You see drawings differently. But what I'd like to do is encourage you also to come along to as many of the drawing discussions as you can. We have a whole programme running on Tuesdays and Saturdays, but with some other sessions in between for those who can't join in person. But we have really enjoyed having you all with us this evening, and we really look forward to seeing you again. The next drawing discussion is on Saturday with Roland Hicks, who is the Evelyn Williams Drawing Award winner, and Penny McCarthy, who was awarded the Evelyn Williams Drawing Award in 2019. So it's a biennial award. So we hope that you'll enjoy coming to find out more about their projects and the way that that's developing or will develop towards their exhibition as part of that award. But in the meantime, the most enormous thank you to Andrea and Craig. It's been really fabulous to hear you. You can put your mics on and clap if you want to. But thank you also to a really attentive audience with lots of great questions too. So thank you. Congratulations on being on the show, in the show. They're fabulous drawings and really wonderful to hear you speak about them. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Anita. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Complete pleasure.